The suitcase was still open on the bed when Harriet Donnelly realized she could not leave. Not because the buckles had rusted in the dry Arizona heat, not because the stage was late, not because her boots had worn through at the heel and she hadn't the coin to replace them. She could not leave because Bernard Dalton was standing in the doorway of the boarding house, his hat in both hands, his dark eyes wet with something she had never once expected to see in a man like him, and he was saying her name in a way that made it sound like a prayer he had been afraid to speak aloud for months. Harriet. That was all, just her name. She pressed her palm flat against the folded blue dress inside the suitcase, the one she had worn on the train from Philadelphia, the one that still smelled faintly of coal smoke and the life she had been so certain she was escaping. Her fingers curled into the fabric. "You have no right to come here," she said, and her voice broke on the last word like river ice in March. "I know it." He did not move from the doorway. "I know I have no right. I came anyway." The morning light fell through the single window of the room and cut a long gold stripe across the floorboards between them, and Harriet thought with terrible clarity that this was the moment everything she had planned would either hold or shatter. She had come to Copper Falls Valley in the spring of 1882 with one suitcase, a letter of employment from the Valley schoolhouse, and a secret she had been carrying so long it had begun to feel like a second skeleton inside her own body. She had meant to stay 6 months, earn enough to disappear properly, and never once let herself feel anything for anyone. She had not anticipated Bernard Dalton. She had not anticipated what he would do to the careful architecture of her solitude. And now it was October. The cottonwoods along the creek were burning gold and red, and her suitcase was open on the bed, and she could not fit inside it the one thing she most desperately needed to take with her. She could not fit inside it her heart, because somewhere over the past 5 months Bernard Dalton had become the keeper of it, and he was standing in the doorway refusing to let her go quietly. She had arrived in Copper Falls Valley on the 14th of May, 1882, stepping off the Butterfield stagecoach with her single leather suitcase and a letter of employment folded 3 times inside her coat pocket. The town was smaller than the advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer had suggested. One main street of hard-packed red dirt, a general store, a saloon called the Copper Kettle, a livery, a telegraph office, a church that listed slightly to the left as though exhausted by the effort of remaining upright, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Eugenia Hartwell, who charged $2 a week and included breakfast and supper but not noon dinner, which she considered a personal indulgence she was not prepared to subsidize. Harriet had stood at the edge of the street with the stage pulling away behind her, raising a long red plume of dust, and she had felt the full weight of what she had done. She had left Philadelphia in the middle of the night with nothing resolved, nothing explained, nothing closed behind her except the door of an apartment she would never return to. She had the employment letter, 6 months of savings, a change of clothes, her school primers, and the secret. The secret, above all else. The man behind the secret was named Gerald Ashworth, and he was a banker in Philadelphia with considerable influence, a wife who wore imported French hats, and a private arrangement with Harriet that had lasted 3 years before she had understood, fully and catastrophically, exactly what kind of man he was. She had understood it on the night of March the 2nd, when she had found the letter in his coat pocket, the one addressed to his associate, the one that described Harriet Donnelly as a useful temporary arrangement that would need to be concluded before the end of spring when certain family matters required proper management. She had not cried. She had packed the suitcase. She had taken the 3 months of wages he owed her from the envelope in his desk drawer, left a single note that said "Only I know," and she had walked to the train station in the freezing Philadelphia rain. She had not looked back once. But secrets have a way of traveling with their owners, and Harriet knew that Gerald Ashworth was not the kind of man who tolerated the possibility of exposure. She had taken nothing that could truly be used against him, only the 3 months of wages that were rightfully hers, but he did not know what she had taken, and that uncertainty would be enough to make him dangerous. She had chosen Copper Falls Valley, Arizona Territory, because it was the most distant posting she could find that required a schoolteacher, and she had chosen the name Donnelly, her mother's maiden name, because it put distance between herself and the name Harriet Moore, which was the name Gerald Ashworth knew her by. She had not intended to stay forever. She had not intended to meet Bernard Dalton on her second day in the valley. He had not been an impressive first sight. She would admit that later to herself, and eventually out loud to him, in the way that lovers admit the unflattering truths of first impressions once enough tenderness has been built between them to hold the weight of honesty. He had been coming out of the general store with a 50-pound sack of grain balanced on one shoulder and a second sack in his other hand, and he had not been watching where he was going. And Harriet had been walking with her head down because the Arizona sun at 8 in the morning was already a level of assault she had not expected from a climate she had read about only in books. They had collided with considerable force. The grain sack on his shoulder had split. Harriet's hat had gone sideways. For a moment they had simply stood and looked at each other through a slow drift of white grain meal falling between them like indoor snow. "I beg your pardon, ma'am." His voice was low and a little roughened at the edges, the way voices get when a man has spent more years talking to cattle and horses than to other people. "It was equally my fault," Harriet had said, with more dignity than the situation warranted given that her hat was sitting at a 45-degree angle and she had grain meal on her left shoulder. He had retrieved his sacks, made a temporary repair to the split one with his belt, and walked away without looking back, and Harriet had righted her hat and continued to the schoolhouse and thought nothing further of it. The schoolhouse had been her salvation in those first weeks. It was a one-room building with 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and their chaos and need and the honest mercenary straightforwardness of children's curiosity had given her something to anchor herself to. She loved teaching with a sincerity she had never been able to fake. The moment chalk met slate, and a child's face shifted from confusion to comprehension, was one of the few things in her adult life she had found purely good, without the complicated shadow of someone else's agenda falling across it. She had settled into a routine. School until 3 in the afternoon, then a walk, then supper at Mrs. Hartwell's table, then reading by lamplight until she fell asleep. She had begun to know people's names, which was the first step in knowing a town. The blacksmith, Mr. Acaffer, a tall man from Georgia who had come west after the war and whose laugh could be heard from 2 streets away. The storekeeper, Mr. Pearson, who extended credit with reluctance and recorded every transaction in a ledger he kept under the counter as though it were evidence in a trial. Dr. Ambrose, who was 62 and whose hands shook slightly but whose medical instincts remained sharp, and the various ranchers and their families who came into town on Saturdays, the women to trade and gossip, the men to conduct business at the saloon and the telegraph office. Bernard Dalton was one of those ranchers. She had learned his name before she learned anything else about him. He ran the Dalton Ranch, which was the largest cattle operation in the valley, had been his father's before him, and had passed to him 6 years ago when his father died of a heart attack during a difficult winter. He was 31 years old. He was not married. These 2 facts were apparently of consuming interest to every woman in Copper Falls Valley over the age of 16, which Harriet learned because they were discussed at Mrs. Hartwell's supper table with the enthusiasm of a campaign strategy. "A man with that much good land ought to have a wife," Mrs. Hartwell said one evening in June, passing the bread with one hand and conducting an invisible argument with the other. "It's wasteful is what it is, all that space and only him in it. Perhaps he prefers it," Harriet had said, without particular investment in the question. Mrs. Hartwell had given her a look of such concentrated wisdom that Harriet had felt briefly X-rayed. "No one prefers being alone, dear. They only learn to tolerate it until something better comes along." Bernard Dalton came back into Harriet's direct experience on the 23rd of June, a Saturday, during a thunderstorm that came off the mountains so fast and so furiously that it caught half the town outside and unprepared. Harriet had been on her way back from a visit to the dry goods store when the sky simply dropped, and she had taken shelter under the wide overhang of the livery because it was the nearest structure. Bernard Dalton had arrived 2 minutes later, moving his horse into the livery first and then stepping under the overhang himself, water streaming from the brim of his hat in a small waterfall, his shirt soaked through and his expression one of profound resignation, as though this was simply the latest in a long series of things that had happened to him without his permission. He recognized her at the same moment she recognized him. "The schoolteacher," he said. "The grain man," she replied. He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Then one corner of his mouth had moved in what she would later come to recognize as the closest thing to a smile that Bernard Dalton produced during the first 3 months of their acquaintance. A small, reluctant thing, barely visible, like a candle being lit in a room with several windows. They had stood together in the drumming dark of the storm for 40 minutes, watching the street turn to red mud and the rain come down in curtains, and they had talked, not about anything of consequence at first. About the town, about the school, about the range of mountains to the north that turned purple in the late afternoon light, about the quality of the general store's coffee, which was poor, and where a person might find better, which turned out to be the back room of a Mexican family named Delgado who had been selling ground coffee and tamales out of their home on the east edge of town for 11 years. She had learned, carefully and without seeming to probe, the basic shape of his life. He had been born in this valley. He had gone east to Missouri for schooling at 16 and come back at 18 with an education and a persistent and unsatisfied hunger for something he could not name precisely, which he had spent the next 13 years trying to work out of himself through physical labor and long hours, and the demanding complexity of running a cattle ranch in difficult country. She had not told him anything true about herself. She had given him the story she had given everyone. Philadelphia schoolteacher, seeking a change of scenery, drawn west by the employment advertisement, interested in the experience of frontier education. Nothing about Gerald Ashworth, nothing about the name she had left behind. Nothing about the particular quality of her fear, which was still present every morning when she woke and checked the door as though she expected to find a letter with a Philadelphia postmark slid beneath it. But she had noticed something in that livery doorway that she had been reluctant to examine too closely, which was that she had talked to Bernard Dalton for 40 minutes and had not once thought about Gerald Ashworth. This was rarer than it sounds. July came in with a heat that was physical in its intensity, a kind of heat that Harriet had not believed was possible outside of the interior of an oven. The valley turned from gold to a bleached near-white under the sky's relentless attention, and the creek that ran through the center of the valley, which the locals called Copper Creek for the color it turned when the light hit it in the afternoon, dropped to half its spring height and moved with a slow, thoughtful deliberateness, as though conserving itself for better seasons. The children in the schoolhouse were harder to teach in July. They were hot and restless, and their minds were outside in the way that children's minds always are in summer, reaching through the windows toward the freedom of the season, and Harriet had to employ every creative method she knew to hold their attention for the required hours. She read them stories aloud. She took them outside for arithmetic lessons in which they counted actual objects, fence posts, cottonwood leaves, the stones in the creek bed. She let them write their own stories on Friday afternoons and read them aloud to each other, and she had been struck by the directness and strangeness of their imaginations, the way children who grew up in this landscape wrote about it with a matter-of-fact vividness that no Eastern writer could purchase with careful study. It was during one of these Friday storytelling sessions that Bernard Dalton appeared at the schoolhouse door for the first time. He had come to speak to her about his younger sister's daughter, a girl of 9 named Clara, who had recently come to live with him after her mother's death and her father's subsequent inability to manage a child alongside his grief. Clara had been enrolled in the school for 2 weeks, and Bernard wanted to know, plainly and without ceremony, whether she was managing. Harriet had looked at Clara Dalton across the room, a small girl with her uncle's dark eyes and a self-contained stillness that in a 9-year-old spoke not of peace but of a grief too large to express, and she had felt something move in her chest that was not merely professional concern. "She is managing," Harriet told him carefully. "She is quiet. She is watching. She is learning how to trust that the world will continue to be present. That takes time." He had looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did, with that quality of attention that was not quite intense but was entirely complete, as though nothing existed outside the radius of the conversation. "You understand children," he said. "I understand grief," Harriet said, and then stopped herself because that was too much, too close to something true, and she watched his eyes register the distinction. He thanked her and left, but he came back the following Friday, and the Friday after that. It became a small ritual, formalized by repetition, without either of them agreeing to it directly. He would come at the end of the school day on Fridays, ostensibly to check on Clara, and he and Harriet would speak for 15 or 20 minutes while the children filed out, and Clara gathered her things with the careful deliberateness of a child who had learned not to rush anywhere. Sometimes they walked down to the creek with Clara between them, and the child would crouch at the water's edge and study the small creatures there with a scientist's focus, and Bernard and Harriet would walk slowly at the bank and talk. He was not an easy man to know. She recognized this with the particular clarity of someone who herself was not easy to know. He was not cold, but he was careful, the way men are careful who have been responsible for a great many things for a very long time and have learned that carefulness is the price of keeping things intact. He had a dry, quiet humor that appeared rarely and without warning and was more effective for its infrequency. He read, which surprised her pleasantly, and had opinions about what he read, which surprised her even more. He had a copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species on his shelf, alongside a Bible, which told her something important about the complexity of his inner life. She was building a portrait of him with the patience and attention she gave to everything she cared about, and she was careful not to examine too closely why she was doing it. August arrived, and with it a letter. It was in her mailbox at the post office on the 3rd of August, addressed to Miss Harriet Donnelly, Copper Falls Schoolhouse, Arizona Territory, and the handwriting on the envelope was not one she recognized. But the postmark was Philadelphia, and the sight of it landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings of cold outward in every direction. She carried it back to her room at the boarding house without opening it. She set it on the table. She stood and looked at it for 10 minutes. Then she opened it. It was not from Gerald Ashworth. It was from her friend Margaret Ellison, the only person in Philadelphia who had known where Harriet was going, because Margaret was the one person Harriet had trusted enough to leave a forwarding address with in case of genuine emergency. The letter contained the genuine emergency. Gerald Ashworth had made inquiries. He had spoken to Margaret directly, presenting himself as a concerned former employer worried about Miss Moore's well-being, which was a performance of such transparent false concern that Margaret had seen through it instantly, and had sent this letter the same day, warning Harriet that he was looking, that he had resources, and that he had apparently hired a man, she wrote, someone described to her by a mutual acquaintance as a private inquiry agent, which in the blunt language of the frontier meant someone who found people who did not want to be found. Harriet sat on the edge of her bed with the letter in her hands and let herself feel the full shape of the fear for exactly 3 minutes, because she had learned that giving fear, its 3 minutes prevented it from expanding to fill every hour. Then she folded the letter, put it in the bottom of her suitcase under the blue Philadelphia dress, and began to think. She had 2 options. She could leave immediately, disappear again into the anonymous West, find another posting in another distant town under another name. Or she could stay and trust that the distance and the name change were sufficient to protect her, and that Gerald Ashworth's hired inquiry agent would reach a dead end before he reached Copper Falls Valley. She could not make herself leave. Not yet. Not when the school year was not finished. Not when Clara Dalton was just beginning to speak in full sentences again after weeks of quiet. Not when Friday afternoons at the creek had become the axis around which her week turned. She told herself that last reason was secondary. She did not quite believe herself. She stayed. She watched the mail more carefully. She told no one about the letter. September brought the first cool edge to the mornings, a reminder that the world beyond summer still existed, and Harriet felt herself relax by gradual increments as the weeks passed without incident. The school year was progressing well. Clara Dalton had begun to laugh occasionally, which produced in Bernard a quality of relief so profound it was visible from across a room, a kind of brightening, as though something internal that had been held under pressure was slowly being allowed to ease. It was in September that Bernard Dalton did something that shifted the nature of what was happening between them, past any point of comfortable denial. He had ridden out to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday, which was not a Friday, which was therefore not part of any established pattern. The children had just been dismissed, and Harriet was at the board erasing the day's arithmetic, and she had heard the horse and assumed it was a parent coming to discuss something about a child, and so she had not turned immediately, only said, "Just a moment, please," while she finished erasing. "Take your time," said Bernard's voice behind her. She turned. He was in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which was a habit of courtesy she had noticed in him before, the removal of the hat when speaking to her, done without apparent thought, automatically, which meant it was genuine rather than performed. He looked as though he had come from the range, dusty and sun-worn, and as though he had ridden directly here rather than to the ranch first, which meant this had not been planned in the careful way that Bernard Dalton usually planned things. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, "and I didn't want to wait until Friday." "Ask it then." He turned the hat brim in his hands one slow revolution. "There's a harvest supper at the Pearson barn on Saturday. Most of the valley attends. The food is considerable, and there is dancing if you're of a mind for it." He looked at a point slightly to the left of her face, which she recognized as the particular geography of a brave man in a difficult moment. "I would be honored if you would attend with me." The silence lasted long enough that she saw him begin to prepare himself for a decline. "I would be glad to," she said. He looked at her directly then, with that complete attention that was his particular quality, and she saw in his expression something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but existed in the warm territory between them. The harvest supper was everything the community of a small valley town could be when it had made up its mind to celebrate. The Pearson barn was enormous and old and smelled of hay and wood and the particular sweetness of autumn air, and it was lit by 20 lanterns along the walls and 3 hanging from the ceiling beams, and the effect was warm and gold and alive. Long tables down the center held more food than Harriet had seen assembled in one place since she had attended a political dinner in Philadelphia years ago. But this was nothing like that stiff performance. This was generous and unself-conscious, people bringing what they had grown or made, competing in the specific way that good cooks compete, not meanly but with the pleasure of abundance. Bernard had arrived at the boarding house at precisely 7 in the evening in a clean white shirt and a dark jacket that fit him well across the shoulders and made him look, Harriet thought with an internal honesty she permitted herself only because no one could see it, remarkably handsome in the specific way of a man who does not know or particularly care that he is. He had brought her a small bunch of the yellow wildflowers that grew along the creek bank, wrapped in a piece of brown paper, presented with the directness of a man who had decided to do a thing and was committed to doing it without excessive fanfare. She had put them in her water glass and carried them anyway. They had danced. This had been the surprise of the evening, because Harriet had not known whether Bernard Dalton danced, and she had allowed herself to imagine it might be an awkward obligation, a concession to social expectation rather than genuine pleasure. She was entirely wrong. He danced with the same quality of focused attention he brought to everything, not showy or performative but present, and she had found herself in the center of a barn in Arizona territory dancing with a cattle rancher in a way that felt, absurdly and completely, like the most natural thing she had ever done. "You're surprised," he said, reading her expression with that disconcerting accuracy of his. "I am," she admitted. "My mother was determined that all her children would dance properly. She said it was the single social skill you couldn't fake with confidence." He moved them through a turn. "She was right about most things. She sounds remarkable." She was. The slight tightening of his jaw told her the loss was not old enough to be painless. "She died 4 years ago. She and my father within 18 months of each other. The ranch and I have been managing each other since then." She had a sudden, vivid image of this man alone in the large ranch house, managing the complexity of grief and work and the relentless practical demands of keeping something alive in difficult country, and she felt a tenderness that she recognized with some alarm as being considerably past the casual. "And Clara?" she asked, moving to ground that was safer for both of them. "Clara is the best thing that's happened to this ranch in a long time," he said, with a simplicity and sincerity that made her close her eyes briefly against the feeling it produced. October had arrived like a benediction after the long heat, and the valley had turned extraordinary, the cottonwoods along the creek going gold, and the mountains taking on their purple afternoon quality, and Harriet had begun to understand with a clarity that was almost physical why a person would choose to build a life in this place. Why this particular combination of light and land and air could hold a person so completely that the word home might one day feel appropriate where it had never felt appropriate before. She had stopped checking the mail with dread. She had told herself that Gerald Ashworth's inquiry agent had simply not found her, that the name change had worked, that 6 months of distance had reduced the urgency of whatever anxious proprietary impulse had set him looking in the first place. She had been wrong about that, as it turned out. On the 14th of October, a man named Charles Prout arrived in Copper Falls Valley on the stage from Tucson. He was a lean man of about 40, with a city suit that was visibly wrong for the climate and a quality of idle watchfulness that Harriet clocked within 45 seconds of seeing him across the main street, because she had learned certain things about self-preservation in the past year, and that particular quality of watchfulness was one of the things she had learned to recognize. She did not panic. She went back to the schoolhouse, dismissed the children with their assignments, and sat at her desk and thought with the cold precision that genuine fear produced in her when she allowed it to be useful rather than paralyzing. He did not know her face with certainty, or he would have approached her directly rather than observing. He had a name and a last known location, Philadelphia, and had traced her this far through some combination of methods she could only guess at. The posting in the Inquirer, perhaps, which had used her real first name and the schoolteacher qualification, both of which were true. He would make inquiries. He would be told there was a Miss Donnelly at the school. He would come to see her. She had one evening. She sat with that fact for a long time. And then, with a decision that arrived with the completeness of something long prepared, even if not consciously planned, she put on her coat and walked to Bernard Dalton's ranch. She had never come to the ranch before uninvited. She had been there once, when Bernard had invited her and Clara for Sunday dinner in September, and she knew the way, 2 miles east along the creek road to where it turned south toward the foothills, and the Dalton property began at a post-end wire fence, with the brand burned into the gate post. She walked the whole way in the October evening, her breath making small clouds in the cooling air, and she thought about what she was going to say. She had not worked it out fully by the time she arrived. The ranch house was lit from within, warm gold light in the windows, and she could hear Clara through the open kitchen window, talking in the particular animated way she had begun to use in the past weeks, the sound of a child re-entering her own life. Bernard came to the door before she could knock, which meant he had heard her on the porch, or perhaps seen her coming up the road through the window. He looked at her for one moment in which she saw him read something in her face that shifted his own expression from surprise to concern. "Come inside," he said. "Not yet," she said. "I need to tell you something, and I need to do it out here because once it's said I may need to leave quickly depending on your response to it." He was very still in the way he was still when he was paying full attention. "Tell me," she told him. "All of it. Gerald Ashworth, the nature of their relationship, which she described with the directness of a woman past the point of shame about things that had been done to her rather than by her. The letter she had taken, the wages she was owed, the night she had left, the name change, Margaret's warning, and the man who had arrived in town today with a city suit and the look of someone paid to find people." She told him all of it in less than 10 minutes, standing on the porch of his ranch house in the October dark, and when she was finished she waited. Bernard Dalton looked at the mountains for a long moment in which she could hear the creek running somewhere below the property and the sound of a coyote far out on the flats. "You were protecting yourself," he said. "Yes. From a man who deceived you and then tried to manage you out of existence when you became inconvenient. That is an accurate summary. And you changed your name and came here because you needed distance and safety." He looked at her directly now. "Not because you had done anything wrong." Something in her chest that had been braced for a long time released slightly. "Nothing wrong, only taken what was already mine." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "His agent will make inquiries tomorrow. He'll be told there is a Miss Donnelly at the school. He'll come to see if she matches what he knows." "Yes. What does he know?" "A physical description and a first name. My real surname, Moore, does not match my current name. If he has a photograph, it would be harder." "I don't know whether he has one. People in this town," Bernard said carefully, "know you as Miss Harriet Donnelly. They have no reason to describe you as anything else. If this man makes inquiries and is told that Miss Donnelly has been here since May and is a schoolteacher who keeps her own business, there is nothing in that to connect to a Miss Moore of Philadelphia. Unless he has a photograph. Unless that." He leaned against the porch post. "Does Ashworth have a photograph of you?" She thought about it. There had been one taken at a photographic studio on Chestnut Street in the summer of 1880. She did not know what had happened to the print. "Possibly," she said. "Then we need to think about this carefully." He straightened. "Come inside. Let me get Clara settled and we will think about this." The kitchen of the ranch house was warm from the stove and smelled of the supper they had recently finished, roasted meat and cornbread. And Clara was at the table with a school reader that she set down when Harriet came in with the immediacy of a child, who was genuinely pleased to see someone, rather than merely politely acknowledging their presence. Harriet sat with Clara for 20 minutes while Bernard moved around the kitchen with the focused efficiency of a man who thought best when his hands were occupied, making coffee and setting out cups, and they talked about the school reader, which was Aesop's Fables, and Clara had strong opinions about the relative justice of several of the fables that Harriet found entirely reasonable. When Clara had gone to bed, Bernard set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from her, and they talked for 2 hours with the directness of people who have decided to abandon preliminary maneuvers in favor of the actual conversation. "I won't leave," Harriet said, at some point in the middle of this. "Not because I'm foolhardy, but because I am tired of being chased out of my own life by men who think they own the space I occupy." Bernard looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was admiration and concern in equal measure, and also something warmer and more specific than either of those things, something that she was not yet prepared to name directly, but that she felt in the full length of her body. "Then we make sure he has nothing to find," he said. The next morning, Charles Prout made his inquiries in Copper Falls Valley and found exactly what Bernard had predicted he would find. A schoolteacher named Harriet Donnelly, who had been living quietly in the valley since May, who was well regarded by the community, who was engaged to be married to Bernard Dalton of the Dalton Ranch, and who bore no resemblance in character or circumstance to the woman he had apparently been sent to locate. Harriet had learned about the engagement part of this plan approximately 30 minutes before it was first mentioned in town, when Bernard had appeared at the schoolhouse at 7 in the morning, with the information that Mr. Okafor the blacksmith and Mrs. Hartwell at the boarding house, both of whom Bernard had spoken to the previous evening, had agreed to support this particular version of events, and that in their considered opinion it was the most efficient way to establish Harriet's rootedness in the valley beyond any inquiry agent's ability to dislodge. "You could have asked me first," Harriet had said. "I'm asking you now." He had been entirely level about it, practical and direct, which was both infuriating and somehow reassuring. "It is a fiction for the purposes of protection. We can dissolve it after this man leaves if that's what you want. I will not hold you to anything you don't choose freely." She had looked at him for a long moment and felt something move behind her ribs, something that the fiction he was describing was perhaps not entirely a fiction for, and she had said, "I choose to trust you. We'll see about the rest." Charles Prout spent 2 days in Copper Falls Valley, drank at the Copper Kettle Saloon, asked questions that received uniform answers, and left on the 3rd morning stage without having spoken to Harriet directly. She did not watch the stage leave. She was teaching arithmetic to 12 children, and she kept her eyes on the board, and only when she heard the stage pull away did she release the breath she had been holding in portions for 48 hours. In the afternoon she went to the creek alone, in the particular October light that made everything golden and specific, and she sat on the bank and let the relief come through her fully, the way you let a wave break over you rather than bracing against it. Bernard found her there an hour later. He had apparently known where to look, or perhaps simply known to look along the creek because it was where they always walked. "He's gone," Bernard said. "I know." She was looking at the water. "Thank you." He sat down on the bank beside her, which was not something he had done before, not sat beside her in that specific proximity, shoulder almost to shoulder, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in the pressure of the air before weather arrives. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment in the way that Bernard Dalton was quiet when he was organizing something important into the right words, because he was a man who believed words should be accurate rather than merely sincere. "When I spoke to Mrs. Hartwell and Mr. Okafor last night, when I said what I said about the engagement," he paused, "I was aware that it was not entirely a fiction." For me, the creek moved past them. A kingfisher shot over the water like a blue arrow and disappeared around the bend. Harriet said nothing for a moment, because she was processing the particular enormity of a brave man saying a true thing he had not been required to say at a moment when the required thing had already been accomplished. He had not needed to say this. He was saying it anyway. "I have been trying," she said carefully, "not to let myself know how I feel about you. Because I came here with every intention of leaving, and I thought knowing would make leaving harder." "It will," he agreed simply. "Knowing always makes things harder." "I am afraid," she said, because she believed in being precise about the things that were true. "I have reason to be afraid of trusting. I have not had good evidence that trusting men leads anywhere I want to go." "That is a reasonable position given your experience," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it, only acknowledgement, which was one of the things she had come to understand was particular to him. "I won't ask you to trust me wholesale. I would only ask you to consider trusting me incrementally, a little at a time, as evidence accumulates." She had looked at him then, this careful, serious, quietly determined man sitting beside her on a creek bank in Arizona Territory in October, and she had thought about all the evidence that had accumulated over 5 months without her trying to collect it. The way he looked at Clara, the way he had listened without judgment to the full weight of her secret, the way he had acted, practically and efficiently, to protect her before she had asked him to, the way he danced, the way he removed his hat. "I think I have already been trusting you incrementally for some time," she said, without admitting to it. "I know," he said, and that small, rare curve appeared at the corner of his mouth. She laughed, which surprised them both, a real laugh that came from somewhere uncomplicated, and Bernard looked at her with that complete attention, and something in his face softened in a way she had never seen in it before, as though some internal arrangement had shifted into a position it had been moving toward for months. He did not kiss her that day. He was a man who believed in doing things in the right order, and there were things that needed to be said and decided before that particular thing. But he walked her back to the boarding house in the last of the October light, and at the door he held her hand for a moment, briefly, deliberately, and the warmth of it traveled up through her arm and settled in the center of her chest like something that had been cold for a long time finally finding the fire. The following weeks were a different kind of living than anything Harriet had done before. She had lived with longing before, that particular Eastern variety of longing that was largely intellectual, the desire for something better understood than experienced. She had lived with passion before, the complicated, compromised, ultimately hollow version of it that Gerald Ashworth had offered, which she now understood had been real on her side and strategic on his, which was perhaps the cruelest kind of asymmetry. She had lived with grief and with fear, and with the sustained, determined effort to continue regardless. But she had not lived before with this specific thing, which was the knowledge that a good man loved her, a man whose love felt nothing like a trap and nothing like a performance, a man whose company was the most comfortable and the most exciting thing she had known simultaneously, which she had not previously understood was possible. They spent time together with deliberate intention and without rushing. He took her riding, on a chestnut mare named Rosanna from his stable, and she had not ridden in years, but the mare was patient and the country was extraordinary, the valley spreading out around them in its complex autumn beauty, the grasses pale gold, the mountains close. He showed her the full extent of the ranch, which was vast and various, arroyos and flats, and a section of high ground to the south that looked across the whole valley in a sweep that made her chest feel enlarged, as though the capacity to contain that much beauty required a physical expansion. She learned about the work of the ranch, not in an academic way but concretely, because Bernard Dalton was a man who expressed love through sharing the actual substance of his life, rather than a curated presentation of it. She met his ranch hands, men of various backgrounds who had worked the Dalton land for years, and regarded their employer with a combination of respect and loyalty that spoke well of how he conducted himself in the daily negotiations of authority. There was a Mexican vaquero named Rodrigo who had been on the property since Bernard's father's time, and who treated Clara with a grandfatherly warmth that made the girl bloom. There was a young man named Thomas from Oklahoma who was 22 and learning the full scope of cattle work with an earnest intensity that reminded Harriet of her most committed students. Clara had become a thread woven through everything. The girl had opened over the course of the school term in the way that only children can open, fully, and all at once the process began, going from the careful stillness of grief to a running, laughing, arguing, questioning presence that filled the schoolhouse and the ranch house, both with the evidence of her return to herself. She loved Harriet with the uncomplicated directness of a child who needed a woman-specific presence in her life, and had recognized in Harriet someone worth attaching to, and she had begun, in September, to angle for the outcome she wanted with a 9-year-old's complete lack of subtlety. "If you and Uncle Bernard got married," she said one afternoon in November, sitting in the schoolhouse after the other children had left, "you would be my aunt properly and not just my teacher." Harriet kept her eyes on the papers she was grading. "That is an observation with a fairly transparent application, Clara." "I know," said Clara with equanimity. "I'm not trying to be subtle, Mrs. Hartwell says subtlety is overrated. Mrs. Hartwell says many things. She says Uncle Bernard looks at you like the valley looks at the sun. I asked her what that meant and she said I'd understand when I was older. Harriet set down her pen. Clara, she said, yes, you are 9 years old. Almost 10. You are almost 10 years old and you are already managing people with the confidence of a woman 4 times your age, and I say this as someone who finds it admirable and slightly alarming. Clara grinned with one tooth missing on the upper left. Rodrigo says I could manage a cattle drive. He may be right. Harriet picked her pen back up. You should not talk to your uncle about things you and I discuss. I haven't, Clara said with dignity. I've only talked to Mrs. Hartwell and Rodrigo and Thomas and Mr. Acaffer. Harriet put her pen down again and looked at the ceiling. It was in November, on a clear cold evening when the first stars were already visible above the mountains at 5 in the afternoon, that Bernard asked her properly. Not impulsively. Not in the heat of a particular moment. Not as a consequence of a scene or a crisis. He had, she would later understand, thought about it carefully and chosen the moment with the same considered precision he brought to everything of importance, which was beside the creek where so many of the significant conversations of their acquaintance had occurred, in the blue-gray light of early evening with the last of the cottonwood leaves on the water. He said her name first, which was always the way he began when he was about to say something that mattered to him. Harriet. Yes. I need you to know that what I am about to ask has nothing to do with the fiction we constructed for Mr. Prout's benefit, and everything to do with what I have wanted to say since approximately July. She waited, her heart conducting itself loudly in her own ears. I want to marry you, he said, not because of the ranch or the practicality or even because of Clara, although she is a significant argument in any direction. I want to marry you because you are the most honest and courageous and interesting person I have encountered in 31 years of looking, and because standing in a doorway at the livery in June and talking to you about the mountains for 40 minutes in the middle of a thunderstorm made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, that the unnamed hunger I have been carrying around since I was 18 years old had finally been given a name. He paused. The name is you, if that was unclear. She pressed her hand against her mouth, not to stop herself from speaking, but because the quality of the feeling was so large that she needed a physical point of contact with herself to stay fully present inside it. It was not unclear, she said, when she could speak again. I want to give you time. I know that trust is not a simple thing for you, and I know that you came here intending something different than what has happened, and I know that love does not remove the complications of a person's history. Bernard. Yes. Ask me the question. He looked at her for a moment with everything visible in his face for once, everything he usually kept carefully managed, all of it simply present, undefended, offered. Will you marry me, Harriet? Yes, she said. I will marry you, Bernard. He closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment she saw something pass through his face that she understood was the release of a thing he had been holding very carefully for a long time. And when he opened his eyes again, there was a quality in them that she knew she would be able to recall with perfect precision for the rest of her life. The exact look of a man who has received something he was not entirely sure he deserved, and is wholly and quietly devastated by his luck. He kissed her then beside the creek in the November evening, with the last cottonwood leaves on the water and the stars multiplying above the mountains, and it was nothing like anything she had been given before, no performance, no strategy, no asymmetry. It was simply him, fully present and simply her, and the long-held cold in the center of her chest finally warmed all the way through. They told Clara that evening, who received the information with the expression of someone who had put a great deal of organizational energy into an outcome and was gratified to see it arrive. I knew it, she said. You maneuvered it, Harriet said. Same thing, said Clara, and went back to her supper with enormous satisfaction. They were married on the 7th of December, 1882, in the Listing Church on the main street of Copper Falls Valley, with the valley's community assembled in its entirety, because Copper Falls Valley was the size of a community where everyone attends everything and considers it a birthright. Mrs. Hartwell wore her best black dress and cried from the second row. Mr. Ackeffer laughed so loudly and joyfully during the reception that windows were felt to rattle. Rodrigo played guitar, badly but with tremendous feeling. Thomas danced with Clara, who wore her best dress, and supervised the entire event with the focus of a professional. The Reverend, a patient man named Father Graves who had presided over Copper Falls Valley for 15 years, and had developed a philosophical acceptance of the irregularities of frontier life, performed the ceremony with dignity and a brevity that Harriet appreciated, because she was not a woman who needed ceremony to be long to be true. Bernard held her hands throughout the vows and looked at her with that full, complete attention, and she looked back at him with all the honesty she had, and they said the words simply and meant them entirely, and that was that. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the first winter of Harriet's adult life that felt like shelter. Not the absence of cold, but the presence of warmth, which is a distinction that sounds minor and is in fact everything. The ranch house was large and well-built and held the heat of the wood stove efficiently, and the evenings were long and lamplit, and filled with the domestic texture of a shared life. Clara at the table with her schoolwork, Bernard reading or working on accounts, Harriet preparing the following day's lessons or simply reading herself, and the particular quality of silence between people who are comfortable enough together to be silent without it meaning anything other than contentment. She wrote to Margaret in Philadelphia, a careful letter that said enough to communicate her safety and happiness without providing specific enough information to be useful to anyone with bad intentions. Margaret's reply, which came in January, contained the information that Gerald Ashworth had apparently turned his attention to other concerns, that his household had recently been the subject of some social difficulty that had occupied his considerable ego more thoroughly than the pursuit of a former associate, and that as far as Margaret could determine, Miss Harriet Moore of Philadelphia was no longer anyone's active concern. Harriet read this letter twice, then went to the kitchen and told Bernard. He listened without moving from where he stood at the window, watching the winter light on the mountains, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like setting down something very heavy," she said. "I didn't realize how heavy until it was gone." He came to her then and held her, without flourish, simply and completely in the middle of the kitchen in January, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the accumulated weight of the past year, the fear and the secrecy and the relentless management of her own exposure, finally lift from her body like weather clearing. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and certain. "I know," she said. "I know I am." Spring came back to the valley with the inevitability that spring always has, the quality of a promise kept. The creek rose again. The cottonwoods leafed out in new green. The mountains lost their snow gradually from the lower slopes upward, revealing the varied geology beneath, red rock and gray, and the deep amber of the iron-rich formations to the north. The valley filled with the industry of the season, calving on the Dalton Range and planting in the kitchen gardens, and the clearing and repairing that winter always creates work for in the spring. Clara finished the school year in May with a performance that filled Bernard with the specific pride of a parent, which was what he was in all but legal and biological precision. She had caught up the ground lost in the difficult autumn of the previous year, and then surpassed it, and at the end-of-year exhibition she stood at the front of the schoolhouse and recited from memory a poem she had written herself about the valley in autumn, with the directness and precision of a child who understood already that the world could be held in language if you worked at it hard enough. Harriet stood at the back of the room with Bernard beside her and felt something so complete and so clear that she had no word for it except home, except that home had never meant a place to her until this year, and now it meant this specific convergence of people and land and season and the accumulated weight of chosen attachment. In June of 1883, Harriet discovered she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before telling Bernard, not from hesitation or uncertainty, but from the particular private pleasure of knowing something beautiful before it became shared, before it entered the world of consequence and planning and responsibility, while it was still simply a fact that existed only inside herself, intimate and extraordinary. When she told him, they were at the creek again, in the afternoon, because the creek had become the place where the true things were said. It was a habit they had made without deciding to, the way the best habits form. She simply said it, looking at the water. "We are going to have a child." The silence that followed was brief and complete, and then Bernard made a sound she had never heard from him before, a low, involuntary sound from somewhere very deep, and she turned and found his face in a state of such unguarded and overwhelming feeling that she felt it strike her in the chest like light. He reached for her hand and held it, the way he had held it at their wedding, with both of his. "When?" he managed. "December, I think, or January." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and she felt his breath there, unsteady, and knew that the feeling moving through him was the same one moving through her, too large to be contained, pressing at the edges of every ordinary thing. Clara was told that evening. "A baby," she said, with the reverence of a child confronting a concept that has suddenly become real rather than theoretical. "A baby," Bernard confirmed. Clara looked at Harriet with an expression of such complex and tender feeling that Harriet thought, with a clarity that went all the way down, this is what family looks like when it forms itself from choice and love rather than circumstance alone. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" Clara asked. "We don't know yet," Harriet said. "We won't know for some time." "I would prefer a boy," Clara said, with the authority of someone who has given this considerable thought. "A boy would be new. There are already enough girls in this house." "There are 2 of us," Harriet pointed out. "Exactly, a solid number, we don't need more." Bernard laughed, fully, the laugh that he had that came from somewhere completely undefended, the laugh that Harriet had discovered was one of the things she was most grateful to be the cause of, and Clara looked enormously pleased with herself, and the evening closed around them warm and gold and entirely right. The summer of 1883 was long and full. Harriet continued teaching until August, when the heat and the increasing evidence of her condition made the physical demands of the school day impractical, and she handed the class to a temporary teacher from Tucson who had been found through the territory's education office, a capable young woman named Miss Crane, who shared Harriet's instinct for making arithmetic tactile. Harriet supervised and advised from a comfortable chair she had installed at the back of the room for the last 3 weeks of August, which the children found either reassuring or extremely funny depending on their temperament. She was teaching again in September. Nothing was going to stop that. The ranch had a good summer. The cattle came through the heat in good condition. The range grass held better than in previous dry years, because Bernard had made careful decisions about grazing rotation, and the price at the fall market was strong enough to justify the expense of several improvements to the property that had been deferred through the lean years following his father's death. He added a proper milk house, replaced the aging south fence line, and began construction on an addition to the ranch house that would expand the family's living quarters in preparation for the new arrival. Harriet watched the addition take shape through the autumn with the particular feeling of seeing a future become material, becoming wood and nails and window glass, taking the specific shape of a life she had not planned and could not have imagined a year and a half ago, standing on the Butterfield stage with her single leather suitcase and her secret and her careful intention to stay only long enough to disappear properly somewhere else. She thought about that often, in the rich autumn of 1883. She thought about the woman who had arrived in this valley in May of the previous year, braced and defended and determined to feel as little as possible. And she thought about the distance between that woman and the one she was now, and the distance was not measured in miles. October came again, and the cottonwoods turned gold again along the creek. And this time Harriet walked the creek bank with Bernard's hand in hers, and the considerable evidence of the approaching child very present between them. And the light was the same specific October gold it had been the year before when she had sat on the bank alone in her relief, and let the fear of a year begin to dissolve. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Bernard asked her once on an October afternoon, not with anxiety in it, simply curiosity, the kind that comes from knowing a person well enough to ask the questions that matter. "No," she said, and then more precisely, "I think about the version of myself who was going to leave. I try to understand her. She was doing the best she could with what she had. And now I have more." She looked at the creek, at the gold reflections moving on the water. "I have considerably more." He squeezed her hand. "I nearly didn't come to the livery that night," he said. "You were caught in the same storm I was." "Yes, but I nearly went to the smithy instead." It was closer. He was quiet for a moment, considering the alternate geography of a life in which he had turned a different direction in a rainstorm. "I'm glad I was lazy." She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, careful with her in the way he had been all through the autumn, the specific tenderness of a man who knows what is most precious to him and handles it accordingly. Their son was born on the 14th of January, 1884, in the ranch house, attended by Dr. Ambrose and Mrs. Hartwell, who had appointed herself essential to the proceedings with a firmness that no one had been inclined to challenge. Clara sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours with Rodrigo, who told her stories about Mexico that she listened to with the concentration of someone filing them away for future use. Bernard stayed throughout, because he was a man who understood that presence is the primary form of support, and because the thought of being anywhere else was simply not available to him. He held Harriet's hand and said her name when she needed anchoring, and did not flinch at anything, which endeared him to Dr. Ambrose, who had seen many men sent from their own children's births for unhelpfulness. The boy arrived in the early morning, at the exact hour when the sky outside the east window began to lighten from black to the dark blue that precedes dawn, and he arrived with considerable vocal force, expressing his opinion of the transition from warm interior to cold world, with a directness that his mother found immediately and absolutely recognizable as characteristic. "He has opinions," Harriet said, exhausted and entirely awake. "Clara will be thrilled," Bernard said, his voice doing something unsteady that had nothing to do with the boy's volume. He was a large, healthy infant with a full head of dark hair, and his father's particular quality of focused attention already present in the way he regarded the faces above him, as though cataloging them for future reference. Clara, admitted to the room when the immediate practicalities had been managed, approached the bed with the solemn care of someone about to handle something irreplaceable. "Hello," she said to the baby, in the specific voice she used for things she considered serious. "I'm Clara. I'm going to teach you everything important." "He weighs 8 pounds, Dr. Ambrose noted, writing in his record book. "Healthy, strong. Well done, Mrs. Dalton, Mrs. Dalton." Harriet felt Bernard's hand tighten around hers at the name. She looked at him, and he was looking at her, and she saw in his face the full weight of everything they had arrived at from such unlikely starting points: the grain meal in the street, the storm at the livery, the October creek, the truth told on a porch in the dark, the fiction that had become the truest thing she knew. They named the boy James, for Bernard's father, with William as his middle name for no reason, except that they both found it sturdy and honest, and those seemed like good qualities to carry through a life. James Bernard William Dalton was, from his first days in the world, a person of extraordinary persistence and good humor. He fed enthusiastically and slept in long stretches that made Harriet grateful in ways she had not known she was capable of being grateful for sleep. He regarded the world with the calm interest of someone who had decided it was probably fine, and Clara read to him for an hour every afternoon, with a dedication that had shifted her own reading progress forward significantly, since her brother's tastes were not limited to the beginner primers, and she had worked her way up to make good on her promise to teach him everything. The spring of 1884 moved through the valley with the generosity that good seasons have. Harriet returned to the school in March with James in a basket at the back of the room, a decision she had made unilaterally, and the school board had accepted with the pragmatic flexibility of people who had limited options and a genuine appreciation for their schoolteacher's quality. The children regarded James with the collective ownership that children extend to babies introduced into their territory, checking on him at intervals, competing for the privilege of carrying him to his mother when he woke, and treating any disturbance to his sleep with outrage. Life had taken on the texture of something fully inhabited. This was new to Harriet in the deepest sense. She had lived in places before, occupied them for practical purposes, moved through them with competence and efficiency. But she had not lived inside a life the way she lived inside this one, from the center, with the full weight of her presence. She and Bernard had the particular marriage of people who became each other's primary conversation, the person whose thoughts and observations you instinctively root toward, because they will understand them most fully. They argued with the honesty that trust makes possible, not cruelly but directly, and resolved things with the same directness, and the making up after disagreements had a quality of warmth that Harriet suspected was one of the better arguments for allowing disagreements in the first place. He still removed his hat whenever he spoke to her. She had noticed this and found she still noticed it, which was, she thought, the thing about love that the books tended to get wrong. They depicted love as a sudden arrival, complete and entire, but the reality was better than that. The reality was that love was a continued arriving, repeated in small recognitions. The hat, the hand on her back, the way he listened, the rare full laugh, all of it continuously rediscovered, which meant it was continuously new. In May of 1884, exactly 2 years after Harriet had stepped off the Butterfield stage with her single leather suitcase, the town of Copper Falls Valley held its spring fair, which was a tradition of considerable standing, involving competitions for the best pie and the best preserved and the best embroidery, a horse race on the flat ground south of town, a shooting contest, and a general assembly of the valley's people that served the social function that frontier communities require. The necessary reminder that no one is alone in the difficulty of the life. Harriet walked through the fair with James on her hip, and Clara holding her other hand and Bernard at her side, and she thought about the woman who had arrived here 2 years ago with one suitcase, and a secret, and a careful plan to feel nothing and stay briefly and disappear cleanly into some further geography. And she felt something that was almost amusement at the ambitions of that careful, frightened woman, who had not known what was waiting for her in this valley, who had not known about a rainstorm and a livery, and a man with dark eyes who removed his hat and removed every defense she had built against the world. She had come to the valley with one suitcase. The suitcase was still at the ranch house. She had repaired the latch in the winter of her first year, and she kept it in the wardrobe of the room she shared with her husband, and sometimes she saw it when she opened the wardrobe, and she felt the entire arc of the past 2 years run through her in the span of a breath, a whole life remembered in the sight of old luggage. What she had left with, what she was leaving with every day of her continued and expanding life in this valley, could not be fitted inside it. Not James, who at 4 months old was conducting an enthusiastic investigation of the world from the vantage point of his mother's hip, his dark eyes moving with focused interest over the faces and colors and sounds of the spring fair. Not Clara, who had grown 2 inches since September and was currently in a state of competition with a boy from the Hargrove Ranch over a sack race, and was conducting herself with the focused ferocity of someone who genuinely intended to win. Not the friendship of Mrs. Hartwell, who had become the grandmother the children knew best. Not Mr. Ockhaffer's laugh, which was part of the landscape of this town as surely as the mountains were. not Rodrigo's guitar on summer evenings when the work was done, and the sky went that particular purple above the western ridge. Not the fact of being known fully, without performance, without the management of exposure, without the constant vigilance of a person who cannot afford to be seen all the way through. Bernard knew her, had known her from the night on the porch when she had told him everything, and he had responded not with judgment but with the straightforward practical question of what needed to be done. He knew the shape of her fear and the history of her trust and the specific texture of her courage, and he loved her with all of it present, not despite it but including it, which was the only kind of love that she had found she was able to fully receive. Not the valley itself, its particular quality of light and air, and the red earth specificity of a landscape that had become, by gradual and unstoppable increments, the place that home meant. None of it would fit in the suitcase. All of it was what she had left with. All of it was what she carried forward every day in the body and the heart, and the accumulated daily substance of a life that was entirely, completely, impossibly hers. The spring fair moved around them. Clara crossed the finish line of the sack race ahead of the Hargrove boy and threw her arms up with a triumph that made Rodrigo cheer from 30 feet away. James grabbed a fistful of Harriet's hair and examined it with the concentration of a scientist. Bernard took the fistful of hair gently from his son's grip and redirected the small hand toward his father's own finger, and James held on with the surprising strength of infants. And Bernard looked at his son with the expression he always had when he looked at his son, which was the same expression he had when he looked at Harriet, that complete, present, unguarded fullness of a man who knows exactly what he has and considers himself entirely, justifiably, grateful for it. He looked up and found Harriet watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, and then, because she had learned the value of the true thing, said plainly, "Only that I am glad I did not get back on the stage." He smiled then, the real smile, not the small, reluctant corner-of-the-mouth movement of their early acquaintance, but the full thing, the one she had been responsible for discovering, and she felt it in the usual place, deep and warm and entirely certain. "So am I," he said, "every single day." Clara came running from the direction of the finish line, still triumph-bright, her dress dusty and her hair escaping from its braid in 4 places, and she came directly to Harriet and Bernard and planted herself between them with the complete assurance of someone who has arranged her world to her satisfaction and is enjoying the results. "I won," she announced. "We saw," Harriet said. "That boy has no chance against me in any race. I told him so last year and he didn't believe me, and I told him this year and he should have believed me then." She looked up at both of them with the expression that meant she was about to say something that had been assembled with care. "This is a good day." "It is," Bernard agreed. "All the best days are here," Clara said, with the simplicity of a child stating a fact. "In the valley, with us." Harriet looked out over the spring fair, over the faces of the people who had become her people and the landscape that had become her landscape, over the life she had not planned and could not have imagined, and would not exchange for any careful plan she had ever made. And she felt the full weight of it, not as burden but as substance, the beautiful, irreplaceable, unpacked weight of everything she had been given by staying, by trusting, by allowing herself to be found in the best sense of the word. By a valley and a man and a child, and the self she had been capable of becoming when she stopped running. She had come to the valley with one suitcase. What she carried now had no handles and no lock and no way to be set down at a station platform and left behind. It was hers. It was home. And it was, in every way that had ever mattered, enough. James made a sound of profound contentment against her shoulder, and Clara took her hand, and Bernard's arm came around her in the warm May afternoon, and Copper Falls Valley held them all in its particular light, and Harriet Dalton, who had once been Harriet Moore of Philadelphia, who had arrived here with one suitcase and a secret and a plan to disappear, breathed in the smell of wood smoke and cottonwood and the clean mineral air of the high desert, and she was, at last, entirely and completely still.